Live? Okay, so I'm going to take the first one here is from Kate May. Oh, I'm sorry. So we have the panel here today in Bridgewater. Dr. Andy Wynot, our vegetable pathology specialist, Taylor James, basil farmer extraordinaire, and representing Zone 7 is Anya Raskin, sorry. And I'm Nick Polanin, agricultural agent here in Somerset County, moderating the panel session. We have a first question from Kate May on how big is a bunch, and does the 3,300 bunch per acre mean for one cutting for a season?
Okay. So how big is a basil bunch really is up to you and the sort of relationship that you've established with either your customers and market or your wholesaler or your retailer. And like they touched on in the video, there's a variety of ways that you can cut, market, and then sell that basil. So what we did for the budget piece is we estimated a bunch of basil to be approximately 1/4 pound, and that was kind of the numbers that we were using for that. And the retail value that we also used was for selling at a farmer's market type environment, which again, depending on your bunch size, your market, and your people. Unfortunately, I wish I could say a bunch of basil is $4 organic, but you know, again, it's about how you package it and about how you sell it as well.
I mean, I can speak to the larger distribution market and major retail chains. You know, if you're doing that bunch like in the video, you know, that's a 15-pound box. It probably weighs between 5 and 7.5 pounds. So it's not a small bunch. I mean, those are pretty massive. And that's, especially when you're producing around New Jersey, the standard out of South Jersey is big bunches that are coming in somewhere around, you know, 1/3 to like 1/2 pound or even more.
The other question here I saw, and then we'll get to something live here, is the profitability for Genovese the same as for others like Thai basil?
I mean, in our experience, you're going to get profitability based on volume out of the Genovese basil. The specialty varieties, you're just never going to sell quite the same amount of volume. In terms of price, that one I'm a little less certain on.
Price is still about the same, you know, and it's, while you're going to do a lot of volume with the Genovese basil, and there's still a lot of heirloom varieties out there that are enticing to grow. And you know, when you're looking through a seed catalog, I mean, it's really fun to pick and choose Miss Burns lemon basil, or you know, Greek basil, or Thai basil. Thai basil, cooks and chefs love it. So and there's a little bit more of familiarity with people who are showing up at farmers market stands or at CSAs, and so we found that some of our Thai basil did pretty well, and that customers liked it. But like Anya said, that you know, the main beast is the sweet Genovese basil, and then sort of secondarily the purple basil.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Hi. Does the pricing fluctuate over the market year? Like, is the Christmas season a much higher price substantially? How does it go?
So yes, I mean, there's basically two ways to approach a market. If you have a good relationship with your customer, you can lock in a price year round. However, like the larger, larger volume, the prices will fluctuate, and what you see is basically a seasonal flow. In the main season, you're looking at $5 to $8 per pound, and that's like in the bulk sale. And this is terminal market pricing, so that's the price to the distributor. That's for volume. That's when you're sending out, you know, massive quantities. And then once the field basil drops off, then you're into your hydroponic and your greenhouse basil, and then the price kind of goes up. And But then there's a different sales strategy because, right, your larger customers will fall off. And then you're looking at cultivating kind of special relationships with people who want to support local greenhouse production because it is more expensive.
A question from Bordentown was, well, a combination, Cape May and Bordentown. One was, do basils grow better north-south or east-west orientation? And then what, thank you. What was the other one? How does an organic farmer limit insect damage to basil? So we can combine those two together.
Does basil grow better north-south or east-west? In our field this year, we had it going east and west, which is, if I'm not mistaken, the way that most people recommend you install a greenhouse, and that gets the most amount of sun over the bed of basil. And like Andy said, sun is good for leaves drying out and avoiding fusarium and mildews. So in that regards, I'd recommend going east and west. What was the second question?
The insect damage for an organic production in basil?
How do you limit insect damage? Oof. It's a tricky one to mitigate some of that insect damage, especially because basil, unlike a pumpkin, if it's got the markings on it, people just generally shy away from that. We tend to have growing organically, we don't have a whole host of chemical combatants for bugs, but we find that in general the bugs are going to other crops on our farm. They tend to bother the brassicas and the solanaceous crops, which are also around during the time that we're growing basil. And we don't really have too much of an issue with the beetles. There is some worry with worms and with cutworms. However, keeping the crop clean is really important. And like Andy said, it eliminates those other climates for bugs to hang out in, and also for the different fungal diseases to hang out in. So we keep it clean. Keeping it clean really helps. Sort of anecdotally, I had a patch of basil right next to a weedy patch of basil next to a lot of pigweed and ragweed, the basil looked like a joke compared to the stuff that was in clean, straight, cultivated beds.
From Bordentown, the question: what is the length of your season, and what types of basil other than sweet basil do you grow?
Okay, that's a good question. So the length of the season from the farming perspective, we put it out right at last frost date, and so I like to have it transplanted and ready to go in the field right at last frost date. For us here in these parts, it's around Mother's Day, but it's a total guess. You can definitely get away with pushing the limits and by planting around these parts early May if you've got row cover or something else to keep the basil a little bit warmer. And then we grow successions of basil basically until the August harvest, which is the point at which I can count on for sure we're going to have disease and pest problems and I just can't grow anymore. So that's basically our season. So our harvests of basil are ready from the middle to end of June, basically through July, and then a couple weeks in August if we're lucky. Oh, and then the different types of basil. My favorite for growing and some of the favorites that my customers have shared with me. By far, obviously, the sweet Genovese basil and then the purple basil is what we grow. Then the varieties go on, and there's a lot of fun varieties. You've got lemon basil, lime basil, Greek basil, holy basil, cinnamon basil, which I really like, Thai basil. So how do you narrow this down? It's in a production field, find that a lot of those specialty basils, especially if you transplant them, go to seed very quickly. And a lot of them aren't great for, just for sort of a production scale harvest. For example, the Greek basil, while it's very aromatic and makes great pesto, is this kind of short, squat, semi-funny looking plant that doesn't bunch well. So it doesn't work as well in the mix. The Thai basil for us sometimes bolts very quickly. Same with the lemon basil and the lime basil if it doesn't have enough nutrients or if it's heat stressed or water stressed. So the ones that we've stuck to at Flipside Farm are your Genovese basil and the purple basil. And I always give a shot at one or two other basils in the mix to see what's going to be the next thing that my customers like. And I find that of all those, the cinnamon basil and the Thai basil are pretty neat because the plants are strong, so it makes me happy as a grower. And it doesn't flower as quickly, and people really like the novelty of both of those different flavors. The lemon and lime basils are nice, and you can really pick out those hints of flavor. But again, from a growing perspective, it's a little tricky to keep healthy and not going to seed on a larger scale than just the garden.
Yes.
Who are your seed suppliers in addition to Johnny's?
In addition to Johnny's. What are my seed suppliers in addition to Johnny's? Johnny's is a good company, High Mowing. I get a lot of seeds from High Mowing. As a certified organic grower, I've shied away from Fedco. They don't quite have the variety, but I still use them. I think they're a great company. And then also Seed Savers Exchange. There are a couple other companies out there that sell some nice heirloom varieties like Territorial and Sustainable Seed Company and a couple of others, but I stick with High Mowing and Johnny's primarily for organic basil varieties.
I'm going to take one and then we'll come back in. Okay, so a couple questions for Andy. Does growing hydroponically or in a greenhouse reduce the chance of downy mildew? And what are the pesticides recommended currently for downy mildew and fusarium wilt, if any?
Okay. The first question was, does growing basil hydroponically or in a greenhouse reduce the chances for downy mildew? And that's no. Any disease you see out in the field, at some point in time, you will see in your structure, whether that be a high tunnel or greenhouse. So you have to be prepared. You may not show up as soon or as early as be as severe, but at some point it will cause you problems. And basil downy mildew is no exception. And once it's inside, it can be even more difficult to control because of the lack of products you have. But you also have to harder time controlling your relative humidity and things like that. So yes, you will see diseases inside. The second question was, what are the
recommendations currently for downy mildew?
For downy mildew, there are, conventionally there are products labeled for downy mildew in the field. So in order to use those products, you would have to have a pesticide license and be a conventional grower. Organically, unfortunately, if you're organic or sustainable grower, we've done fungicide and biopesticide efficacy trials for a number of years now, and none of the organic compounds give us nearly as good control as your conventional products. So at best, with anything that's organic, you may get some suppression as long as the disease severity remains low. And that's been a problem with organic basil production. There's just very few options. And of those options, there's very few things that can give you the control you actually need to control the disease. So hopefully in a few years we'll have some resistant varieties that would be available on the market, and that would be your best way to control basil downy mildew, would be with genetic resistance in the host.
I'll add to, from the grower's perspective, I'll add to what Andy said. We, for our later seedings of basil in the greenhouse, I sometimes use a product called Actinovate. It's a biological fungicide that's OMRI approved and works. However, a lot of people say it doesn't work, and I'm just wasting my time with it. And it's also a little bit expensive. So you can kind of go, you can go both ways on it. It is, again, a preventative, so you can't sprinkle these bacteria on a plant with downy mildew and expect it to go away. And the other tool that's useful for organic growing in the greenhouse is an oxidate or some sort of, what is that? Exactly. So if you see some molds on little seedlings or like a spore or spot, you can sort of hit it with that product, and that will eliminate it then and there if it can be eliminated. But again, that depends on what the actual disease is, and then how quickly you're able to get the oxidate onto it.
Taylor brings up a good point. If you wait to try to control basal downy mildew after you see it on your field or in your greenhouse, you won't be able to control it. So anything you apply, whether it be organic or a conventional fungicide, you need to start early before downy mildew shows up in your operation. Remember, with the oxidate type products, they're disinfestants. All right, so just like cleaning off the counter in your kitchen, all right, it's only going to control what it comes in direct contact with. All right, so in order for a product such as oxidate to be really effective, you need to get it to the bottom sides of the leaves. All right, because if it doesn't come in contact with the fungus, it's not going to work. And remember, downy mildew, like all your other downy mildews, will only sporulate on the bottom sides of leaves. So coverage is very important for efficacy when it comes to controlling basal downy mildew. Fusarium wilt is extremely tough to control conventionally as well in the organic operation. Conventionally, there just aren't any fungicides available to control fusarium wilt, not only in basil but other crops. So your best way to control fusarium wilt would be to rotate away from that field or block wherever you've grown basil and had the problem. Right? There are a few basils on the market that do have fusarium wilt resistance. Nufar would be one of them, and there's going to be a future Rutgers release that should be out next year that has fusarium resistance or tolerance to it. So with fusarium, you can buy varieties, find varieties that carry some resistance or tolerance to the fungus.
In the commercial production guides and pesticide recommendations, these are all detailed for growers.
Chemically wise, yes, and there's some information in our commercial production guide for basil production for controlling downy mildew. There's also other sources online where you can find this information. I do have a statement from Jim regarding our basil breeding program that I can read at some point tonight.
Yeah, we can do that after the break when we come back to the panel.
Okay, that'll be perfect.
You had a question.
This appears to be very labor intensive. Is there much of this coming in from foreign countries, or any efforts being made to develop robotics to help in producing basil?
It seems, so your question, I guess, it seems like it's a labor productive or labor intensive crop. Is there, are there efforts being made internationally with robotics to help ease this?
Robotics, labor costs mostly are less expensive out of this country, and we don't have laborers here easily to find. So I'm wondering, if they can do it cheaper and get it here, is there a market, or we have any kind of competition from foreign countries? And then the second question would be, you see so many things being done with robotics now that, things that you wouldn't imagine could be done. Is there anything working along those lines to help in this area?
So I see a lot of competition for a lot of products. Basil's not one of them in terms of international competition. It's just so freaking perishable. I don't even see a lot of out-of-state competition for basil, and that might just be because New Jersey produces a lot of it.
That's what I thought.
In terms of mechanized harvest, I don't hear about it in the basil fields, and I don't hear about it in the greenhouses either, except in the the ones that do like baby greens that are mowing. That's the only time I've heard of it. But then that's your leaf pack where they would run the mower over the hydroponic beds the same way you would run it over baby spinach.
So then a good follow-up from Cape May, and I guess this will be the last question before our break, is how much basil acreage can be farmed by one person? I mean, if
Yeah.
you were a total one-man operation. Because how many acres do you have basil now, and how many people do you have?
Right. So how many acres could you realistically farm with one person? Oh boy. If you were only growing basil, you could definitely hammer out a system that works really well. So that what you could do is skip the greenhouse, direct seed it, and tractor cultivate it with pretty good success. And I'd say after 4 acres, you'd pull your hair out. But just as a comparison, we grew 400 bed feet or row feet of basil this year at Flipside Farm. 400 row feet. I could do the calculations, but I don't know, a 20th of an acre, a 40th of an acre was enough basil for a couple of weeks for our CSA, which is how we primarily distribute it. That's a question to answer. But acres, could you, I guess, I'd say 4, and then you pull your hair out.
Okay. Looks like Pete wants to ask Andy a question. Okay. This is our break, right? From 7 to 7:10, as far as I know.
Oh, it was a 20th of an acre.
Sorry?
Did the math.
Jenny did the math. Of course.
0.04.
Let me just make sure that they're good. Any other questions here before we go on break?
There's a few large scale basil producers in the country that would produce and harvest basil mechanically, just by chopping it, throw it in the back of a large truck, and they would be drying it for, herb-based type dried products. Not too many. And they're just looking for volume. They want as much volume. They want weight, fresh weight, which would be a totally different operation than growers here in New Jersey would be doing.
Companion growing with basil.
Yes,
Do
companion
anything
growing.
Row by row, or
I intended to try to sneak a row of basil in between tomato plantings, thinking it would be, or actually specifically in between cherry tomato plantings, thinking, on those old timer books, they always say plant carrots with peas, marigolds with a nice companion planting. I don't know.
Does it have benefits to the growing, like insect with disease resistance? Or anything like that?
I would say it's likely anecdotal, so I couldn't speak to it 100%. But if what I would say, and something that kind of goes back to the last question, is if you're doing a U-pick operation, planting basil with tomatoes is a fabulous idea. And it's one thing that I've done in the past. I haven't done companion plantings. Right at the beginning of cherry tomato season is also sort of the end of our basil season, and having some U-pick basil right next to cherry tomatoes at our farm, which is part of how we implement the CSA with the U-pick crops, is a great thing. People can go out there and cut basil when it goes to flower for bouquets, and it just looks nice and smells nice, because even rotting basil smells nicer than rotting tomatoes.
So with that, we're going to take our break, because the other sections are taking break as well. And then we'll reconvene in about 7:10 or 7:12, basically.
so I don't know.
So you had mentioned, as an organic grower, so that you're
We're not sure what we want to do with it. And then the other, like 10 acres, I want to
I'm testing for Jenny, so see if she can hear me and if anything's okay. I know it's hard to hear down in Cape May. We're all the way up here in Bridgewater. Sound does travel slowly. Come on, Jenny. Can you hear us? Can you hear me now? Jenny's having issues. Well, of course, Jenny's. Taylor, if you had to identify one strength based on your location, what would it be?
Well, the reason I meandered all the way up to Bedminster, Far Hills, New Jersey, I'm not originally from New Jersey, but one of the best things about my location is being pretty darn close to New York City, the biggest city in the world, and I figure there's a bunch of people over there who need to eat food, and
I can provide for them. So that was the very first thing. It's like close to the largest urban center of the world. The strength of my location is the for the model of organic farming that I use, which is the CSA model to distribute produce. There are a lot of educated people in my area and in around my area that are on board with this local organic movement, and so I'm capitalizing on that as well. And those are the people who are curious about a variety of vegetables and produce, and also a variety of herbs, and especially basil. And that's why it's very fun to be able to grow a couple different varieties for people who may actually know what they are and appreciate them for all of the deliciousness that it really is.
Anya, what would a threat be to any of your growers or to your distribution network?
Threat to the distribution network. On the passenger seat, because that's not food safe. And you can't store it outside of your refrigeration units, because that's not food safe. We love basil. Crops that are straightforward go into chilling and come back out.
When, let's say, if your labor is seasonal in nature, well, of course it is, when? And then as a CSA operation, you're direct to your stakeholders.
Allows me to be flexible as a farmer. That's one of the, it fits my personality the most. And I know we're talking about SWAT for basil. I did that whole SWAT thing for, all right, I want to grow organic produce, how am I going to sell it and make money? And I found that for me, the CSA model works really well. Because I don't have to load up a truck, go to a market, I don't have to hire 10 people to harvest an acre of basil to get it to my wholesaler. It really works well for me, and so it kind of mitigates some of the threats of growing basil, because if I don't have basil, well, oh well. I have oregano. I hope you like oregano.
you have your members come to your farm to pick up their shares? Is that how that it gets distributed?
Yes. So a good chunk of our customers come.
As a companion planted with tomatoes, encourage people to get out to the fields. It definitely adds a sort of aggregate benefit to it. And then we were mentioning, it's hard to control, you pick basil, like, how do you monitor, how do you make sure that people aren't trampling the basil or the vegetables in the next bed over? So, there's pros of that, and also it's tricky to figure out how to monetize, basil as a U-pick crop as opposed to berries or strawberries, But it's certainly beneficial. There have been a lot of our customers that, like our CSA because they can go and pick, basil or flowers. And basil also serves the nice double purpose of flowering.
How many existing farmers here? And what are you all growing now? Everything?
Some carrots, we do those from pots. Those do well with carrots, so we do those, so we do fruits.
Okay. And have you done a SWOT analysis with either a crop or the business itself?
Not yet. No, we probably
It's definitely worthwhile. From the marketing perspective, because the CSA isn't for everyone, and even the way CSAs are running now, it seems it's been evolving, and certain CSAs I used to be a member of, I don't buy into anymore because it's just a prepaid debit card. And it's to me, it's a disconnect to the crop. You're just giving me a Visa card that I can go shop in your farm market, as opposed to a box of produce that I can do whatever I want with once a week or once a month. And that's just me personally. Other people react differently because it's a convenience of I prepaid, I'm investing in the farm and now I can go and shop at his market. If I'm local, that's great. If I gotta drive out of my way, well I drive out of my way for a box of produce. But just to go, that's just me. Doing that kind of, how many of you that farm are LLCs? That you protect yourself, the business from the family or the personal. How many of you, if you're running a U-pick or a CSA comes on the farm, you have separate insurance for that? You need to protect yourself. Like Saddam, who is going to be here, Saddam Insurance, he's also president of New Jersey Farm Bureau. He always talks about insuring yourself and don't skip. If you're going to go for $500,000 in insurance, go for the $1 million because it's not that much more, and it'll protect you and your business and your farm. So doing all that kind of business, you're not haven't even put a seed in the ground yet, and you're already crossing T's and dotting I's, trying to figure out the business and the legal side of things before you get into, is it Genovese versus Thai versus purple versus cinnamon versus all those other things. So it's a lot of things that sometimes, that's why when we did Annie's project, when we did later life farming, estate planning, transfer of farm, things like that, it's almost like this individual denial or avoidance of those issues because I want to be busy planting and growing the crop and selling, but you've got to, to sustain yourself and protect yourself, you want to have all those other things in place too. A business plan, a mission statement, a vision, where do you see your farm you know, that horrible interview question, where do you see yourself in 5 years? You know, and everyone says 5 years older. But, you know, to ask that question of a farm or of a business, your customer base, things like that, to expand. So now I'm off my soapbox, and is Nick missed? M-I-C-E-D? Mic'd.
Mike.
Sound is gone.
We have no time. So
Okay.
switching one thing. So if you could repeat all the questions, even if Nick said them, just repeat the questions.
Okay, we can barely hear Nick.
It's all right. You're good.
Time delay, okay. So we're back to the panel discussion and presentation and answering questions for the next 25 minutes until 5 to 8. And then I'll briefly discuss the evaluation form, which I'll put in front of me so I don't forget about it. So you have some questions. So some of the previous questions we're going to try to catch up on. This doesn't say really who the question is for, so it's open to the panel. From Bordentown, are there any extended production techniques for basil? I assume that means to extend the season?
Are there any extended production techniques for basil? Yes, there are. There certainly are. Using the greenhouse for transplants, if we're talking about field production, is an excellent way to get a leg up on your early season plantings. Having your first basil planting go out in the field as a seedling that's had 4 weeks of growing behind it is definitely a great way to extend the season on the early end. You could extend it even earlier if you're growing in soil by putting it out in the field, covering it with a floating row cover, especially a thicker millimeter version of Agribon or something similar to that. And then also the use of a high tunnel, both on the front and the back end of the growing season. The only trouble with the back end of the growing season, extending it past August and September, is and into the colder months, is really just the disease issues that are lingering on from August onwards. So, in my personal opinion, I found it that season extension is better on the earlier end if you're growing in soil.
From Cape May, can you cut basil and place it in a vase like you would flowers?
Great question. Can you cut basil and put it in a vase like flowers? So there's been much of the video and our discussion has been, well, how the heck do you store this crop? And when we have basil available at our CSA for pickup, we tell people to do exactly that. Treat it like a flower, put it in a vase, and keep it on your counter. That's the best way it's going to store. And in fact, we've done a little bit of trial with some small wholesale deliveries where we've literally just filled lugs with a couple of inches of water, stood up all of the basil bunches in there, and just shipped it out. And that tends to work, and we've had some good feedback with it. It's just kind of logistically tough to keep basil standing in water during transportation.
We have the most success with hydro basil that actually comes with, like, in the sleeves with a little water at the bottom of the sleeve. It's upright, 12 to a pretty tall box, and they're just crammed in there so they're keeping each other from flopping over, and that little bit of water, keeps it from really being damaged in the cold truck, I suspect.
Yeah.
It's not scientific analysis there.
From Cape May also, how do you prevent basil from getting stalky?
How do you prevent basil from getting stalky? It's a good question. First of all, if your soil quality is really good, and if it's if there's a lot of organic matter in there, it's composted, it's got good soil tilth, your plants are going to naturally be thicker and bigger. To avoid leggy plants, what you want to do is make sure, first of all, if you're transplanting, you get the transplanted plugs out in the field right when that root ball fills out in your plugs. That'll help prevent the plant from growing straight up and straight into flower. And then lastly, at Flipside Farm, we usually just clear cut our basil because I just don't have the patience to, or the energy to go around and pluck off side stems. But what I found is that if you pluck off side stems, yeah, your plant gets pretty tall and spindly and like quick, and it makes a recutting for like my thick basil bunches a little bit tougher. So I hope that answers the question.
Do you tip prune at any point, like when they're 3 inches or so tall, so you get a nice bushier plant?
You know, we haven't done that. Do we tip prune during the growing season to make sure that it stays nice and bushy? You know, we haven't really done that. What we do is go through and pinch flowers, and I find that that's really the best. That's as much energy and labor I can really afford to put into the crop.
I was thinking when you put the plug in, if you were to tip prune those 2 or 3, 4 plants, then it may be effective. And I think you're saying that may be very effective for us hydroponically as well. To get a denser plant.
Very, very well might be. And one of the things we do, however, we for basil, when we transplant basil after we cut furrows in the field, we actually plant them pretty close together. So that I sort of avoid a lot of the issues of having to grow a big bunch, because I've got a lot of plants right next to each other, and it makes the clipping and the bunching very easy. And still, because the soil quality is really good, I'm still getting full foliage on our plants. Though I should say that does lead me into another question. Pruning off flowers, I found, yes, it is useful, especially on the heirloom plants. I will say this because when you start to get that flower, the plant actually does become a little bit more bitter. And, you know, I don't know, bitter, less sweet, and I don't know what the exact science is, but you know, I've gotten some feedback, some rather blunt feedback this year from my CSA members who have complained about that basil that you saw another week after we did the cutting for the video shoot, because some of it had bolted and we weren't assiduous about pinching off those flower stalks. And one woman told me, it ruined my pesto, I had to throw it all out. And I'm thinking, but it was beautiful. So I do recommend pinching off the flower stalks if you can afford the maintenance for that. And that's just a good way to keep that planting, that succession of basil going for a little bit longer.
2 questions from Bordentown, both on hydroponics. How does hydroponics cost compared to other methods? And does hydroponics change the flavor or speed production of basil?
So hydroponic definitely costs more, especially if you're selling it in the bunched, sleeved, kind of living, sorry, not bunched, in the sleeved living version. And I don't have that price off the top of my head, but I can find it while someone answers the second part.
Is there a difference with hydroponically grown flavor, I guess, or quality? As an organic farmer, I always ask, well, what is, in a hydroponic system, what's being fed to the plant?
There's been studies, well, it's organic, we're feeding them organic material, but there has been studies done that say that there's a lot of factory farmers for hydroponics. They go really low with their nutrients. When you do that, of course, it waters down the flavor of the plant. But there's been studies done to show that actually the nutrients level is a little bit higher in hydroponic plants, and the flavor is, I think
you got to make sure.
As a hydroponic farmer, I think it's a better flavor.
So
better quality,
sweeter. I would say that the customer base for hydro basil is just very different from the customer base for a bulk. Well, I'll call it a bulk basil. It doesn't matter how it's grown, but when it's sold in bulk, you know, that's how your restaurants want to buy it. That's how your processors want to buy it. That's how like home cooks making pesto want to buy it. But in general, on the retail market, that's where you get your sleeved living basil market. And those, yes, for sleeved living basil, you can get more than $1 a piece to the distributor. So that's a that's a lot of money. It's not a lot of yield, right? That's why home chefs love it, but your restaurants aren't, your pizza places don't really want to buy a living, stocky sleeved basil. They just want basil in quantity.
But it has a much longer shelf life, if you will, shelf life in the restaurant or in the store, because it is still a living plant, and a little bit of moisture will keep it alive and crisp and beautiful.
It hasn't necessarily been my experience.
I've had pizza places that have bought the basil and they put it on their counter where they make their pies for the fragrance and just the whole, the whole selling point of it.
I do want to plug the soil though by saying I have had some good basil and I've had some bad tasting basil, and in my field you can definitely trace back to soil quality. Two very similarly planted basils in time.
Hydroponics, I think it depends on if you maintain a good nutrient level.
In a hydroponic system, it seems like you're able to keep those controls sort of the same. In soil farming or dirt farming, there's variations every foot in your soil. But if you are, cultivating and growing good soils with compost and green manures, and you're going to have some really fantastic basil, especially if you cut it young.
The other question I think was about speed, about timing. I mean, our germination, I planted 3 days ago, and my guys for my basil are already coming up. So as far as speed, yeah, for that. But I disagree with him about the water and the soil, because I think they're both equally delicious. But you're using both earth resources, and you know what I mean. And it does depend on the medium it's growing in. So it does depend on the soil. It does depend on it. They're using more nutrients or less nutrients in their water. So I think it's
Personal preference.
Well, speaking of soil health along those lines, there's a question about manure applications, and then how long would you have to wait between that kind of application and, let's say, harvest?
Great question. So the question is about soil health and application of manures, and then the wait till harvest. For certified organic application, or to follow certified organic practices, you need to spread manure 90 days before a harvest of a crop if it's not touching the ground, or 120 days if part of the crop is touching the ground or is in the ground, like carrots. Or you can apply compost, finished compost at any time during your production stretch. However, for us at Flipside Farm, we can't ever make our compost to the organic standards. So I always spread compost, what I call compost, which is really still manure, 120 days before any harvest of any crop, just so that I'm on the safe side. I think, however, animal manures are really important. I like to take those raw manures and compost them at least slightly before applying them on the field to make them a little bit more stable, a little bit less weedy. The more you can cook manure or compost before it stabilizes, gets out into your field, I think the better. But I do think it's an important part to building good flavor, good sweetness in the basil, and also just improving your soil.
Was there a pH mentioned in that basil would favor or do better in, or soil in general?
Questions about pH for basil, and it's stumping us.
It might be in the, I don't remember offhand, it might be in the fact sheet we produced.
At Flipside Farm, the last time that we did a soil test with you, we had a really nice pH reading, like 6.9. So we don't really do anything. We haven't added lime or. We unfortunately have a nice, or fortunately I should say, have a nice pH level for just about every crop except for blueberries.
Andy, you had a statement from Jim Simon to share with everyone about
our basil.
Yes, Rutgers basil breeding program.
The program itself actually started in 2009, 2 years after basil downy mildew first showed up in the United States. Jim Simon and I wrote a couple of USDA grants that weren't funded. In 2011, a grant was funded for 5 years, which just initiated the breeding program that we've started and have continued. So really, we've been breeding basil with students at Rutgers since 2011 with Rob Pine and now Rob Matera. He's taken over for Rob Pine. One girl, Catherine Homer, is working on the fusarium wilt side of things, and a new student who starts this fall, AJ Noda, is going to be working on Basil downy mildew in some fashion or one another. But I have good news. We've been breeding since 2011. In these past couple years, we've developed a few lines that are going to come to market. Right now, nothing's never easy. There's patents to be written and filed, as well as an output large enough to produce the seed, enough basil seeds so it can be commercially available to growers such as yourself. So I contacted Jim yesterday, and he emailed me this morning, and I said, give me some talking points. Well, he gave me a press statement, basically. So I'm going to read it because there's things I'm allowed to say and things I'm not allowed to say at this point. But I'm going to go ahead and read it to you so everybody knows, because we get these questions almost every time we talk about basil downy mildew. So Rutgers has successfully bred several sweet basils that look gorgeous and have been licensed to a private seed company, a new company called Van Drunen Farm Specialty Seeds. Seed production for these new varieties, which are highly tolerant to downy mildew, are being produced now, and the seed company expects seeds to be available for the 2018 growing season. We expect seeds to be limited in this first year. As with any new variety, it often takes the seed company a few years to produce the stock up and to move ahead. The company will likely give priority to commercial growers first. For those who have visited our Rarick and Snyder research farms or Twilight meetings, and for those that have attended or participated in our annual basil taste-off, you've already seen some of these new varieties. While we have over a dozen of completed lines which vary in phenotype and overall aroma and taste, we anticipate the seed company will be featuring and offering for sale initially only 3 of these varieties. Tentative names are being floated around and discussed, but these lines come from a basil breeding program, and frankly, they are the best we have seen among many releases. Over time, we're now focusing on producing smaller leaf Genovese types. The varieties that are completed reflect more. The varieties that are completed reflect more of a large leaf or medium leaf Italian basil. Basil leaves that are cut, but not exceedingly so, more than flat. We are excited. In many of our studies, our plants are the only ones living by the end of the season. Rutgers has also licensed the new Italian sweet basil to Pan American Seeds as an open pollinated fusarium tolerant basil to be called Newton. And that plant looks great, smells and tastes wonderful, and will be good for those organic and other farmers with possible fusarium wilt issues. Keep in mind that Newton is not tolerant or resistant to downy mildew, just fusarium wilt. Our work on fusarium wilt resistance, chilling tolerance, and more continues, and we're now stacking these genes into some of our new downy mildew resistant plants.
So stay tuned for
Yeah, and then you heard it here first.
Well, maybe Kate May didn't.
Okay, well, I can send a
You
statement.
can tell it again, or some of, yeah.
Question, sir.
Yes, I have a question about profitability. Dr. Anderson made a comment to me before. He says, if you want to make $1 million as a farmer, you start with $5 million. So I'm wondering here on these numbers, we're talking about for 1/10 of an acre basil on 1/10 of an acre farm, you're standing to look at a net return of $3,103. If you have a 10-acre farm for 1/10 of an acre, is this saying that if you run 1 acre on a 10-acre farm, you're going to make $66,000 instead of $6,000? And if you end up with after 10 acres, you're going to make $600,000. Am I interpreting that correctly, or is that the kind of money you can really make with this, or no?
I would say that you have to ramp up. Nobody can make, unless your connections are amazing in your first year, start small, find a market, develop customers. and go from there.
Okay, but if you have a market, you find you can sell it, you can get up to those kind of really reasonable numbers. Time like this,
yeah.
you know what, I'd be better off working at a gas station to make this kind of money, rather than putting all this work and effort and labor and money into it. And I can make a hell of a lot more just doing that. Or in my profession, I can do some tax returns and I'm done in one, a couple of nights.
So those numbers are basically for direct to direct to consumer price. So basically, that's a farmer's market price. The trouble is that you could go to market if it was a great one, like Summit Market or any of the other great ones that you've got around the state, and sell 100 bunches of basil. The problem is once you get higher than that, you don't have that high retail price that you're commanding. So unless you're doing 30 different farmers markets across the state, and so that's why the tenth of an acre, making $3,000 is a feasible thing, because if you're able to go through and clear out all of your basil and sell each of those bunches of basil at market to the person who's coming by the farm stand to buy a certified organic bunch of basil, well then yes, you can hit those numbers. But unfortunately, that doesn't translate to 10 acres of basil, because 10 acres of basil is like 100 farmers markets 3 times a week, you know what I mean, in terms of commanding that price. So it's tricky to think about expanding production because of the necessary cuts that you're going to inevitably face trying to move that product through a wholesale outlet.
Then you're talking about ramping up your efficiencies, because ultimately farming, that's why distributors exist, right? Because it is an economy of scale, and after those 100 bunches are sold at a farmer's market, it starts costing you more and more to move the next 100 bunches, whereas you can actually become more efficient by, say, outsourcing your distribution arm and your sales arm to a distributor. And yes, you're making less per bunch, but you're making the same profit overall, right? Because you're outsourcing the cost of sales and marketing and distribution and collections from restaurants, who are the best. Love restaurants.
Okay. Thank you.
So I hope that gets at least some way to that answer.
Yes. You had mentioned earlier seed sources that you had recommended or you used and had success with. There was a question from another site about if you could just repeat or give that list again about the seed sources, and then what soil mix do you use in the cells starting the seeds in the beginning of the season?
Okay, so where do I get seed organic seed varieties from? Primarily, my 2 main sources are Johnny's Seeds and High Mowing Seeds. I do get some from Fedco, from Sustainable Seed Company, from Territorial, and Seed Savers Exchange. I should say Flipside Farm is certified organic in terms of its produce, so what we are looking for is also organic seed. Now, a lot of the especially the heirloom varieties, you may not find a certified organic seed out there in the marketplace, and that's why it's a good idea to have at least a host of a couple of different seed companies to go to. And then the second part of that was
the soil mix in the greenhouse.
What kind of soil mix do we use in our greenhouse? Again, there's farmers have a wide array of soil mixes that they use. Some farmers, especially organic farmers, like to make it on site. I haven't bought into that yet. Right now, I just call it in from McEnroe's Organic Farm up in New York, and I coordinate with a couple of other farmers, coordinate a delivery of an entire flatbed from New York down to New Jersey so that we can save on costs. It's McEnroe's organic potting soil mix, and that is what I use for basil. Sometimes what I do is when we prepare the seeding flats is use that for the base, and then after you put the seeds in the individual cells, I cover it with McEnroe's light potting mix, which is pretty much the same as the organic potting mix. It just has a little bit of extra vermiculite in it, and that'll help hold a little bit extra moisture. And I find that helps in the initial part of the greenhouse growing for those basil starts.
Any other questions for the panel before we?
Yeah, what have you found to be the best animal manure to make into a compost?
What's the best animal manure for compost? Cow manure. Cow manure is great because I can get it in large quantities. Chicken manure smells worse, but those are the two best, chicken and cow manure. I find that they have the least amount of weed seeds, and they require the least amount of conditioning in the compost pile. So while I like to compost every manure that I get, at least to some degree, I find that those are the best. Horse manure takes forever, and that's primarily what we get in Far Hills, New Jersey, with all those horse farms around. So it just takes longer. The nutrients are pretty good. It's just I get more weed seeds than I like, and it takes longer.
How do you know when you get horse manure? Do you test it to see if it's filled with antibiotics or whatever, other drugs that they treated the horses with, maybe?
So that's a great question. Do I test those animals and the bedding from horses? Do I test that for?
Test the manure anyhow.
No, I don't. It might scare me, I guess. I hope it doesn't if we ever were to test it. But what we do is I never put it out in the field immediately. Never do that. I have to let it cook. I mix it with other organic.
You cook it for a good year and then blend it in.
Exactly. And I feel like that certainly helps mitigate the risks from any antibiotics or wood that comes in. I do have a couple of specific transporters, however, that are very careful about the manure that they take out of horse barns. And so I trust my manure transporters.
So they know whether the animals are being treated?
Exactly. So,
I got a fridge at home, so.
So usually before I get a load, they're like, "Hey, this is very wood heavy, or this one's been broken down." I usually kind of get a scope out of what's being delivered to me and what kind of state it's in before I accept it. But in general, I've got a guy who has very strict guidelines on what goes into the container out of the horse barn, and so far we haven't picked up any residuals of metallic substances or any of those other dangerous chemicals or compounds that you might get in those medicines in our plants or in our soil. So
We want to thank the panel very much for all their information today. Drop this down behind it. What every location has. Oh, I can send them back to their seats.
You can sit in that chair. People can see.
Oh, okay. Okay. You have been dismissed. So what? Hi, everyone. Nick Polanin, County Agent up in Somerset County, sharing with you the evaluation form that hopefully all of you have received, and a request to participate in our research study based on our funding from USDA and IFA. The research is confidential. Your information and the records and all the responses that you provide will be kept in a confidential manner, and just basically the responses that we report back would be research-based with percentages and not actual individual information. The research team and the Institutional Review Board at Rutgers University are the only parties that see the initial data, And then we, like I said, we just report the percentages of responses. So if you can read the initial page, the cover page to the survey and the evaluation form. And then the form itself is in the second page, talking about your responses to currently, whether you're currently farming this crop, thinking about doing it in the future, indicating your knowledge before and after the session today on basil. And then on the back side are, do you plan to attend future sessions? We do have three other additional sessions this fall. The one on garlic is in your package this evening. And there are sign-ups available on Eventbrite already for the other sessions through December. So information that hopefully you'll be able to freely share with us. Like I said, the individual data is confidential, and we only report the percentages that is required from the grant funding USDA NIFA. If there's any questions on that, I'm sure your local program coordinators there can answer them for you. I'll take any questions here from Somerset if there are any on the evaluation form itself. If not, I'll collect them here at the table or any table at either doorway that you're leaving. Thank you very much for a great evening. Thank you for coming out, and hopefully we'll see you at the garlic session on October 17th or any of our future sessions. Thank you very much. Have a great evening, everyone.